Hi, this is Dan Hickey. This is a recording of a workshop that was delivered at the Instructional Systems Technology Conference at uh, Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana on March 6th, 2020. I'd like to thank the sponsors for this work in particular. Stacy Maroney in the Office of the Vice President of Information Technology has been hugely supported. This model actually emerged in a grant, a ePortfolio Faculty Scholars grant back in 2008, I believe. But other support from other agencies has gone into this work as well. Huge shout out to the graduate students who have been supported by those grants and other sources along the way. So why situative learning? We had that until the talk. You assume you came here because you're interested in that. Situative theories were really formalized around 1990, coming out of work from the Institute of Research on Learning in the 1980s. So there's broad consensus in 2020. It was really established in 19 by the publication of How People Learn 2, compared to How People Learn 1, which was published at the beginning of the century. HPL2 really emphasized in the very title of it that the role of learners, contexts, and cultures, that context and culture really was more important. So there was broad consensus among the experts brought together that context and cultures matter a lot. However, within that volume, it was clear that there was less consensus about how context and culture should be taken into account. So there was another consensus report that came out around 2011 that said, particularly for so-called 21st century skills, that most instruction should be framed with examples, context, illustrations. Um, but there's really not a lot of consensus about how that framing should be carried out. What I'm going to show you in this workshop is an approach to framing instruction that comes out of a resolutely situative approach to instruction. I believe that framing, as I'll show you, is rarely important for online learning. Um, you typically have to define your frames in advance. You can't frame and exemplify content in the fly in classroom discussions. Um, I think it's important because instructor framing can often be very exhausting for instructors and students in online courses. But it's also quite difficult to assess sort of social online learning. So I think all of the things that I'm going to talk about today really are particularly important when you're teaching online courses. So one question that comes up a lot, I did my dissertation at Vanderbilt. I studied anchored instruction. A lot of people see the implications of situative theories in anchored instruction in PBL. For complicated reasons, I'm going to say that PBL and anchored instruction are really more socio-constructivist because they put individual and social activity on the same plane. Uh, of course, this 1990 article about anchored instruction led a lot of people to think that anchored instruction and situated cognition are the same thing. And I'm going to say that they're really not. The approach that has evolved in my work since my graduate work really is resolutely situative, and in particular, it embraces Greenough's so-called situative synthesis, and it really treats individual activity as special cases of socially situated activity. I'm going to argue first that this is a better starting point for equity and inclusion, as I'll show you. Uh, and it also, though, allows for the entire range of assessments, as I'll show you. It lets you treat a whole bunch of different types of assessments as special cases of disciplinary discourse. So, why formative self-assessments and automated summative tests, as I'm going to show you? Well, I think the conventional assessment really can be overwhelming in conventional online courses. If you try to carry out the kind of assessments that that my advisor Jim Pellegrino describes in Knowing What Students Know, these are very, very labor intensive in many settings. Performance assessment gets you into the complex issue of task-driven versus construct-given assessment. It's really hard to look at what someone did and make judgments about what they know. And I think this is a huge source of instructor burnout in online courses. But on the other hand, teaching to test is a huge problem in online courses. A lot of online courses that I see, at least the ones that don't burn out instructors, are essentially just test prep. Um, you really need assessments that provide evidence of transfer. So, but you also have to deal with the fact that cheating is a really, really big problem in online assessment. Central to the approach I'm going to show you today are what I've been calling Wikifolios, or when they're done on Google Docs, we call them G portfolios. So these are artifacts that are public to the class, right? So everybody in the class can see all the work students do. All of the interaction takes place in threaded comments that appear directly on uh, someone's assignment. So there's no known answer questions in the public space of the class. This approach really only requires public pages that support threaded comments. And in Canvas, this requires students to generate a new discussion each week. You can do this in Google Docs and Course Builder. Um, I recommend what I call semi-synchronous assignments. So these are weekly assignments. There's a weekly deadline. Uh, I have a strict application of a modest late penalty. 1% of your grade out of a points out of 100 per day you're late is usually enough to keep people from getting behind. So the approach I'm going to show you has really evolved over about a decade of work with doing design-based research uh, in a range of settings, starting with Sakai at IU, my own courses in Canvas from 2013 to 16. I got a grant from Google to implement this model in what I call a BOOC, a big open online course. Um, been working with Rebecca Ito and others at Indiana University High School. There's 3 teachers there that have modified this approach for there. And then I've been working hard to develop courses for K-12 networking administrators in California. But this approach has been implemented successfully by about a handful of other adjuncts and AIs in other course contexts. The presentation here today is intended to really help people think about scaling out to multiple teachers and scaling up to more large online courses. So PLA, participatory learning and assessment, is what I call this framework. It's really based on 5 prior programs of design research. So PLA really took shape starting when I moved my courses online. I was working with Jim G. He was an advisor on one of my projects, and I had just this sort of multi-level assessment model, and he really pushed me to get a theory of talk, and that led me to Randy Engel's work. So essentially what I've done is embedded Randy Engel's her framework of PDE, uh, and then expansive framing, which is what she was working on when she passed away in 2012. This expansive framing idea. I've essentially embedded those principles, my own principles coming out of my studies of situative motivation within uh, what I call the multi-level assessment model, and I'll come back to that. And then I've added in some other design principles from working with open digital badges for the last 6 or 7 years. So PLA uh, consisted of originally 4 and then 5 design principles. And what we found over the years, especially at the Indiana University High School work, is these are really difficult for people to implement if they weren't grounded in sociocultural theory. The teachers who were familiar with sociocultural theory were really able to take these, but the teachers who were grounded in cognitive theories really found some aspects of them counterintuitive. I find with people in the instructional design community in particular who are grounded in cognitive theories, they find several of these implications just so different than what people have been doing. So it was just overwhelming. So what I've been doing in the past year, we have an article that I'm happy to share with people forthcoming in educational technology research and development that reframes these design principles as step by step, and that's what we have here. So there you see 8 steps. So what was previously 2 steps or 2 design principles is now 8 individual steps. Our hope is that broader audiences who are either grounded in cognitive theories or not grounded in any theory, such as a subject matter expert who is asked to develop an online course, perhaps one that might be implemented by somebody else, um, could could follow these steps and implement them, and then sort of come back and appreciate why we've done the things we've done the way we've done them because of the way that they foster what Randy Engel called productive disciplinary engagement. So the steps in green are roughly the steps that follow from Randy's design principles. The steps in red are the ones that come out of my multi-level assessment. And the ones in black are sort of the obligatory management steps that just would come with designing any online course. So step one, this is the most important step of all. This is where you have students create a personalized framing activity, ideally one that draws very much from their own experience and interest and that they can revisit throughout the semester and refine as their knowledge of both the content, the disciplinary knowledge of the course, and the context, their framing activity, their framing context. So uh, this is a good way to introduce students. Students are encouraged to look at peer examples. It does require creativity and knowledge of course content. It's relatively easy in a graduate course like mine, as I'll show you. Undergraduate math pilot studies, we use student majors to frame activity. In a cinema theory course, we use directorial roles. The important thing that when you're having people select uh, framing contexts, what differentiates this from other sort of approaches is that the students really should justify their selection in terms of their own interests and goals, and then they should revisit and refine their understanding with every assignment. Here's what this looks like in the assessment in schools course. So let me say a little bit more about this course as a context. I've been teaching it since 2005. It's been a site of a great deal of iterative refinement because I control it and I teach it. And once I moved online, I really I play around with it. I get a lot of feedback from students, and I keep introducing new features there that then move out into other places where we're working on PLA. Most importantly was getting a grant from Google to teach this as a big open online course using Google Course Builder, where we were able to refine, sort of introduce some new features and take advantage of some great teaching assistants, but automate those features going forward to the point that I was able to add hundreds of open learners in my 4-credit class without it being any more demand on me after the teaching assistants went away because my grant went away. So the important thing about this course is that the instructor is really busy. Um, I work really hard to make the best use of my time. Um, so that really what I'm all about is trying to model what this approach is after, which is let's avoid instructor burnout. Let me go ahead and open up my course to larger numbers of students than I'm required to, for instance, so that I can split it into 2 groups and do tests with it and stuff. But again, without overwhelming me. So essentially, though, what happens in this course is that students are learning the language of assessment. Uh, you want to learn them to discuss assessment. In particular, you want a principle in the course to learn how teachers think about some of the complex concepts in validity and vice versa so that they can engage in professional discourse. So back to this step one, this personalized framing assignment. Here's what it looks like. You want to edit your home page to introduce yourself professionally. So, this is what I'm telling the students to do. I provide them a home page and I ask them to explain that this will give your peers some context for understanding your work. Say, tell us about yourself, about me, tell us where you're from, uh, why you're participating in this course, what academic program are you in, what are your goals. Continued, what are your roles, right? You will use this role as your lens for the material we cover in this course. Then describe the context. What's the setting you work in? Try to imagine how your setting will shape your understanding. So right away in the very beginning in this first assignment, I'm introducing what Randy Engel called expansive framing. How will your setting shape your learning in this course? Here's an example from one of the students from a recent course. I'm a music therapist. I've just accepted a position as a special education teacher for a high school. Right, so right away, we're mixing personal and professional factors. I have a dog named Blueberry. So it's really important for students to get this opportunity to project both a professional and a personal identity because those come together. We know in identity research that these are important things. And so g- helping students project both of those things and tie them closely together is a really important thing. Your goals: I want to become more knowledgeable in assessment as my current career was pretty closed-minded to the types of assessments available. That's a really good kind of framing. The role I will be choosing as my lens is that of a special education teacher. So she's taking the new job. She hasn't even started it yet. I will be working. This is really important in terms of shaping my understanding of assessment. I want to push principles and practices that lead to inclusion and that support as that is what my school is focusing on. Notice this relatively informal language. You're trying to get students to write as much as possible. Don't worry, you're not. This is a lot more like a social media than an assignment. That's going to be great. So here's the second part of this personalized framing assignment. So we asked them to go in and draft a curricular aim. So read about good curricular aims in in the textbook. Uh, your curricular aim will be the basis of discussion for future Wikifolios, right? So I'm pointing out that this is something that needs to be accessible. Now, a big problem in a course like assessment is that a lot of students come in kind of conflating the practices of learning with the processes of teaching. So many of them won't give an actual curricular aim. They will actually give a curriculum, a piece of curriculum, and you can't really, say develop multiple choice assessments for a writing assignment. So, and that's fine. That's that they will come to make sense of that as they go forward. So here's an example of that. Uh, of that same student, students will determine a central idea of a text and analyze its development. My idea for addressing my curricular aim is increasing comprehension. So notice this student did distinguish between a curricular aim and the context of that curriculum, my idea for addressing, right? So she's talking about teaching. So this is the kind of example in my course that when somebody does conflate them, I can point to a different student and say, take a look at how she did this. Take a look at, and I can hot link it over to them. Or I might even put it up in an announcement early on. So as I'll describe later when I talk about the step of describing uh, interaction routines, early on, it's really important to kind of get good at finding the good examples and then efficiently pointing other students to good examples like this. Now, on one hand, determining a central idea of a text and analyzing its development, right? So that is a good curricular aim because it lends itself well to multiple choice items, right? So if somebody has a writing curricular aim, it turns out it is possible to develop good multiple choice items of writing, but it's a very difficult thing for a typical teacher to do. That's an item writer's specialty. So that's another kind of thing a nuance that I might make clear by giving a lot of feedback, especially to early posters. So step two, well, this is step two. It might actually lead to an activity. It probably should lead to an activity that actually comes before the activity before. That activity before is just so central that it really is important that they start on that. But I do think it's best to actually introduce students to expansive framing in a very early introductory routine, maybe the first thing that students encounter. One of the things I do is introduce students to personalized engagement with course content. So, for example, you can have students review the objectives for the course and identify the one that they think is most relevant for their professional goals. That's a good way to introduce students to expansive framing. I use a really simple routine that I'll show you uh, in detail in the next step, and that is uh, you might have students summarize the relevance of information about the course or something introductory to the course, rearrange those summaries in order of personal relevance, and then add a justification for those rankings. So in fact, this is really the first assignment in my P507 course. So review chapter one, identify and carefully read the sections that are more relevant to your aim. So right away, I'm helping students see that they want to really customize their engagement, uh, right? Don't assume, students almost never read chapters start to finish. So give them strategies for reading efficiently. So if you work in K-12 settings, you should carefully read pages 5 through 8. Read the chapter summary carefully. Then the next part of this introductory thing is apply and summarize. So chapter 2 has a section. It details 9 things that you should consider when deciding what to assess. Write a summary of each of the 9 considerations in order of most relevant to least relevant, given your role and setting. And add a brief justification for the what to assess consideration that you choose as most relevant and the one you choose least relevant. So, uh, right, so here's the same student. I had a hard time with this section, right? So this is a new strategy. Most students have not done engaged this way before. That's okay. You don't need to worry that much about it. They will get it very quickly. So this student just chose the 2 that she felt were most relevant, and she said why. She still engaged with them, and I'm pretty confident that she probably engaged with all of the aims enough so that she could add a reasonable rationale as to why the 2 that she summarized were most relevant. So this is a really good example. What you've just seen is how students gently and easily sort of come to appreciate that what they're doing in the course is finding the stuff that's most relevant to them and making those connections. Those connections are what the curriculum theorist Bloom described as intercontextualities. They're making numerous connections with course content and meaningful pieces, people, places, topics, and times beyond the boundaries of the course. All right, now this brings us to really a core part that most of the work in defining the course will consist of defining these primary and, as I'll show you next, secondary engagement routines. So the primary routines are the ones that introduce students to content. Every assignment in my courses all have primary engagement routines. Let me show you what these look like. Um, you can use variations. You want to make the routines open enough so that students can adapt them to support PDE. The ranking routine that I introduced before works really well. I'd say I use it probably 3/4 of the time. And this is readily applied to most educational resources. When you have text chapters, what you're really doing here is taking chunks of content and having students engage with the elements of that chunk. For example, by ranking their relevance. It's easy to do with most textbook chapters um, because they chunk content for you. We also use this routine with carefully curated sets of open educational resources in some cases. Something as simple as, here's 3 introductory videos to the topic we're going to learn about this week. Uh, View them and tell me which one you thought was most relevant for your context and why. So, using those, so here's what it looks like. The so here you see a summary using those. So here's what it looks like. The so here you see a summary. Here's what it looks like in P507. So um, I'm going to show you the primary routine that's further on in the course, right? So in the first part of the course, they've created assessments for each type of assessment. So we want them to summarize and rank the sources of validity evidence. So in week 6, now this is a pretty complicated assignment. Validity is a very confusing thing for students. A lot of times they conflate validity and reliability. Um, so the first part of the course, they created uh, example assessments for each of the four primary assessment formats: multiple choice, constructed response, essay, performance, and portfolio assessment. So now, further on in the course, we're using those. So here's what it looks like. The so here you see a summary. So for step 6, so this is a new step. This is a kind of thing. This is an example of what I think I'm trying to help people out with in this new framework. We've added this arbitrary routine. Um, we find that in some content and some courses, it's hard to frame expansively. We're finding this is particularly an issue in STEM. Uh, in some cases, you just have to tell students to memorize something. I know in the cybersecurity courses, my experts in the podcast, they just couldn't make sense of hashing. They couldn't connect the very technical practice of hashing. How is hashing different to K-12 network analyst versus a K-12 network designer? But they just said, yeah, it's something that everybody should know if they're an expert in cybersecurity. So just learn about it. So the important point is learning that something is hard to frame is still a form of productive disciplinary engagement. Now, in the IU finite course pilots, to reiterate, we had students use majors, their course major, to problematize individual assignments. The best example I have of this is from the IUHS biology courses. There, the instructor elected to frame each assignment personally from their own perspective. Now, I'm calling this arbitrary. It's not really that arbitrary. I think it still worked. We saw from the examples that students are doing it. But at the top of each assignment, say a few things about your previous experiences, current interests, and future goals as they relate to learning these main ideas and objectives. So this is after students have viewed a couple of introductory OERs, a couple of videos. Um, Now say a few things about it. This is probably one of the biggest developments of the last several years is really thinking hard. It's really hard for a high school biology student to define an overall framing context, difficult for undergraduate finite. And so having them frame each assignment this way is turning out to be a nice middle ground. So there's an example of the way that the biology teacher eventually settled on implementing expansive framing in her class. Step 7. So now when you've developed the assignments, now you want to define the student engagement routines and expectations. This is where you want to really help students hold themselves and each other accountable to the discourse of the discipline. They're walking the walk and talking the talk. So you want to position peers and instructors as audiences for the new learner generated knowledge, right? So because each student is an expert in their own framing context, they get to explain how the disciplinary knowledge of the course is connected to uh, the disciplinary context. You want to foster this in public threaded comments on student work. As I'll elaborate next, the student should reward examples of PDE with praise and linked announcements. Now, here's the part that is probably very counterintuitive for many of you. You want to avoid assigning points or grades for students' engagement. Don't make students say something when they don't have something to say. It turns out students like talking about their own work, but if you force them to comment, you get this sort of boring, that's nice kind of stuff. You don't get PDE. In P507, students are only required to post one question to their peers and the instructor when they complete each assignment. Um, we did include an optional sort of peer promotion routine that we refined in the assessment book. These are the instructions. So there you see, post a question as a comment to your classmates. They're instructed to discuss and like peer work, review the wiki photos, find one that look interesting, engage in discussion. The goal here is to generate discussion threads that consider how the chapter concepts and considerations take on different meanings for different students. And then promote exemplary work, right? So as part of reviewing and discussing, promote one and only one of your classmates' wikifolios as being exemplary. This is a fun little thing. You want to play around with it in your class to see ways that it works best. Here's an example of a question that a student posted. I'm sure practice makes perfect, but learning all of the ins and outs of assessments, I'm getting nervous that I won't ever to be able to create valid, good assessment for my students. So notice slipping back into this language about uh, valid assigning validity as a property of an assessment. So that's the kind of thing I take note of. The student asked that as a question, and let's watch what happens with this. Here you see that's a comment back from another student, uh, get lots of feedback, right? But continuing to use valid and reliable as properties of assessment. Here this peer provides really nice extended comment. Another student went in and just clicked like on it because they liked that comment. You notice that that's there at the bottom. Um, really simple to give students rewards. You want to acknowledge and reward good engagement and encourage them to do it to each other. Um, and there you see uh, the student responding. Um, right, so that they're really engaging pretty deeply. I really like your statement that you don't know currently the validity, but you know it correlates with your aim, and that's important. And another student responds back to both comments and reiterates a really important point. I also think it is important to remember what Popham said about the higher the stakes, the more you will need to consider all of these elements. So that's a very nice example of what I mean by productive disciplinary engagement, right? They're surfacing their assumptions, right? They're surfacing their continued misconceptions about validity, but they're really engaging deeply with each other. So then you want to sort of carefully define your instructor engagement expectations and routines. Now, depending on the format of your class, if you're designing a course that you're going to implement, you don't really have to do this up front. You do want to find ways to prioritize your time. Um, the most important thing is that you want to maximize PDE. You want to make sure that students are completing the required part of the assignment, but you want to pay very close attention uh, to the public engagement, and you want to minimize the amount of private instructor-student interaction. You want to almost all of your interaction in your course should be public uh, on those threaded discussions. But that doesn't mean you have to participate in every exchange. In particular, if students are posting right against the deadline, you may want to wait until you grade student work to give comments and refer students back to those. What you really want to do is prioritize your feedback that shapes the framing context. So early on, set aside a lot of time to give every student pretty extensive feedback on their framing context. But you also want to introduce more advanced concepts, as I'll show you next, or do sort of recalibration. So one thing that I recommend is early posters tend to be publish pretty long posts. You want to reward those early posters with more extensive feedback. And then post hyperlinked announcements telling others to examine the post and the feedback after they get started with the process. Another thing is you can introduce much more advanced concepts. So rather than putting them in the body of the assignment where they would overwhelm students, take those early posters, reward them with a lot of feedback, and then introduce these more advanced concepts, and then point students to those. And it's a good way of introducing that content. Here's my comment on that previous exchange. Great discussion here, really getting at the role of validity in the classroom. Just think hard about the claims you are making. Most classroom assessment claims are modest, so validity evidence does not have to be very strong. To reiterate, reliability is a property of an assessment, but validity is not. There's no such thing as a valid assessment. Right, so my comment at the end of that comment thread, this is the embodiment of productive disciplinary engagement. So step 7, now this is the beginning of this part of coming out of my own research, about a decade of research from 1995 till about 2007, uh, when I was focusing primarily on creating situative approaches to assessment. So the first step is creating public informal assessments of engagement. So you don't want to grade the contents of the Wikifolios. It's very difficult and time consuming to make valid judgments of what students know based on what they did. So drawing on Melissa Grisolfi's work on consequential engagement, we have students reflect on specific aspects of their engagement, and we use those to award points for completing the assignment. And basically, if students complete the assignment, I give them their full points. And so this is what I mean by what the affordances of Greenough's situative synthesis, because these reflections, they have a summative function for prior engagement, which justifies using them to give points, but a formative function for their understanding of the concepts for the assignment. For complicated reasons, the reflections shape their prior engagement proleptically, right? Because students know they're going to have to make these reflections. It should lead them to engage in these ways while they're working on the body of the assignment. It takes almost no time to award grades. I literally just cut and paste private feedback. The only place where I give extensive private feedback is where where I take away points because students didn't complete the assignment. Here's the prompts. There are 5 of them. There's the instructions. Provide 5 brief reflections. Demonstrate your understanding of the concepts and how they related to your curricular aim. Right. So contextual engagement is the first one. How well suited was your learning goal for working through this assignment? Here's the other 4. Collaborative engagement. What did you learn from your peers? Consequential engagement. Uh, what are you going to do differently in the future now that you've learned this? These last 2 are relatively new. I'm really excited about them. Conceptual engagement. So the self-assessments that I'm going to show you later are relatively not that new. They're about 5 years old. But I added this maybe 3 years ago. So as part of my continuing efforts to motivate students to engage in the self-assessments, I went ahead and had a prompt. Right, so they have to give some evidence that they engage in the self-assessment. And I know from looking, this has almost eliminated students skipping over the self-assessments. Almost every student does them now, and I think that the reflection is part of the prompt there. The last one is really exciting. In response to critiques of of PDE by Priyanka Agarwal, we added this one to get the students to think about personal factors and then allow the instructor reposition students. I'll be doing a talk later today that gives a very interesting example of the impact of the cultural reflection and the repositioning that was afforded by it. Here's an example of one student's reflection, that same student, because so much of what they do in school depends on their ability to write and engagement. So again, she's made a really good connection between validity and her own students. Here you can see that she comments on a peer's question about the validity and how it made her think. So that's kind of acknowledging the input of a peer. Consequential engagement, what are you going to do differently? Especially for ELL students, I have to ask if our assessments are really measuring their understanding of the content. And then conceptual engagement, I understand the concepts pretty well. I did go back and reread the chapter again before I took the self-assessment because I felt that this chapter was the hardest to understand so far. That's what I mean by the power of a well-written reflection. I mean, I don't think the student would lie about that. But I think that the conceptual engagement gave a little backstop. Okay, let me just go ahead and reread this chapter, and then and this is what I mean by the formative self-assessment rewarding the student, because they go in and take the assessment and they nail it. So this is one of many examples that we saw where the cultural reflection led students in the class in P507 who were from a majority racial culture acknowledge that and recognize that that could lead to bias. Uh, just as an example, almost all of the discussions of uh, socio-political factors in the previous version of the course in 2018 came up around the unit on assessment bias. But here you can see that even on a chapter on validity, right, they did bias the previous semester. I thought about the bias from the previous chapter can sneak into the assessment. So they made a really important connection between bias from the previous chapter, validity of the second chapter, while also acknowledging that the student is of a different cultural background than my students. Now I can go in there and I can, really highlight that the student did this. I can go into another student who didn't say this and say, are you sure? Maybe you should think about your background. Are you sure that, because what happened is a fair amount of students in the very first assignment said that their biases didn't make any difference, but they would see that other students would saying, yeah, I might, there might be implicit bias. And so what we saw is by about the end of the semester, almost all of the students were recognizing how bias and potentially power and privilege that come with being a majority might create biases against minority students. Now, while I've changed the order of these self-assessments actually in practice are completed prior to the reflection, but I put them in this order to appreciate that in fact what's going on here is that they're increasingly formal assessments. Those reflections are informal. The self-assessments are semi-formal in that they present known answer questions, open-ended so-called constructed response items. So this is the first time students encounter known answer questions, and they come to appreciate that, right? It's a more formal assessment. You saw what the students said in the previous reflection. This is where their knowledge is going to be tested. So this is helping motivate their prior engagement, but also ensuring that students can engage, that they can transfer their learning from their personalized engagement to the relatively abstract and decontextualized format of an open-ended response item. Now, it's really important that these be different both than the curriculum, and that's not hard because they, right, so they're known answer questions, and so they're almost by definition differently. But you probably shouldn't match them directly to the exam items in the next step. Don't have them one for one, but definitely help them appreciate that engaging with these on their own, with no instructor involvement required at all, will help prepare them for the exam. So you should have about 3 to 6 items. What are the big ideas of the course? These are summative for their understanding, as you'll see, of the understanding that they took away from the assignments, but they're formative for far transfer and achievement. You want to make students aware that the formative assessments are intended to prepare them for the exam, and the instructions should maximize the formative value. Now, again, the instructors don't have to be involved in this at all. You want to make sure that students are actually inserting something, that they're writing something. Um, but this is probably the thing that is most counterintuitive, where I get the most pushback. Almost everybody in formative assessment world, reflecting a sort of cognitive constructivist perspective, says they just assume that formative assessment is about teachers giving individualized feedback. I'm saying no. I'm saying don't do that. That is a really time-consuming thing. This is what Randy Bennett at ETS, he talks about the urban legend of formative assessment. A formative assessment should be, given the amount of time students spend completing it and the amount of time that instructors spend providing formative feedback, a formative assessment should be more valuable than something else students and instructors should be doing with that time. And what I see is a lot of students and instructors spending massive amounts of time on formative assessments. The problem is that when you uh, formalize knowledge or make it semi-formal enough to look like an assessment, that the feedback, it just isn't that valuable. It's helpful, but it's not the same as kind of instructors and students engaging in threaded discussions on the Wikifolios. And so again, you want to preserve your instructor time for more productive kinds of interactions. You want to reward prior engagement, but use the exams to motivate engagement. Here are the instructions. This ungraded self-assessment is designed to let you see if you're prepared to move on to the next assignment. This will help prepare you for the exam. Now, you should be able to write an acceptable answer to each of these questions without looking up the answers, right? So you must write something before you can see the response. If you can write little or nothing from memory, you should search for information and write an answer before looking up information on the web or course resources. If you can't answer them from memory, you likely have not engaged sufficiently. Regardless of your response, carefully read the expert answer and explanation. This is really important because what you can do here is provide a more detailed response, as I've done here, that when a student gets to this point, if a student's done what I just asked them to do, uh, they're at a perfect place for you to go in and include more abstract sense that isn't hard for the student. The student will read it because it's so directly connected with what they just did. And this is why in my situative motivation models, I don't dismiss intrinsic motivation. I just treat intrinsic motivation as a special form of social interaction. It's my sense, it's my assumption, it remains to be tested, that a student at this moment is curious to see what they left out. They're intrinsically motivated to take a minute and read this more detailed explanation because you've brought them to that point. That's a good example of how all of these pieces function together. Um, but the intrinsic motivation is building on the prior PDE. We got them to this point by organizing productive disciplinary engagement. Now let's let intrinsic motivation kick in and do what it does in a very particular situation. Step 11. So again, this is going to be counterintuitive to some, if you're into anchored instruction or problem-based learning. Those socio-constructivist perspectives really are very dismissive of multiple choice tests because they assume that they're only assessing surface level knowledge. I don't think that's true. I agree with assessment testing experts that a well-constructed multiple choice item does not assess recognition level knowledge, but rather students have to reason through and draw on really extensive conceptual knowledge to identify the correct answer in the amount of time given. So my tests are multiple choice, time limited, they're module exams. The important thing that you include best answer items rather than correct answer items, as I'll show you, so you can't look them up easily. You want to provide about 2 minutes per item, and we aim for an average score around 80% with no more than 1 or 2 perfect scores in a class. You don't want to teach to the items, and you should certainly not let them shape course design. You want to protect the validity of scores by not exposing students to the actual associations that appear on the items. You want to protect item and quiz security. Make sure that the answers are not easily searchable. You want to actually right click on those items inside of Google. Most people don't realize, most instructors don't realize, but most students know that you can often find the answer to quiz items because Google says people are also asking. So randomize the order of the items and show them one at a time so that students can't print them out. And only show the overall score, but don't give the answer to each item to preserve the validity. You want to use the item analyses routines that are included in your LMS uh, to find items that have been compromised that are behaving oddly. In P507, we give 3 20-item quizzes. Each one counts for 10% of the grade. So if you look at the item on the left, right, you can't really look that up. That's not going to show. Uh, Likewise, the item on the right. So if you look at item test banks that come from the publishers, they often will provide well-written items like this one. Now, obviously, as in an assessment textbook in its 8th edition, these are really, really good items. These are better items than I probably could have created myself. And they're hard items. Uh, I'm pretty confident that students who do well on these items are going to definitely understand well enough to use this knowledge in a subsequent setting, but they didn't get this knowledge studying it in the abstract. They got this knowledge by engaging in it uh, productively with their peers in their own context, but they took away this relatively expert knowledge that allowed them to quickly identify the correct answer to each of these items. So step 12, create, again, we're back into PDE. One way to help foster PDE is to create models. Um, Model Wikifolios are helpful for younger or inexperienced learners. I've found that this is a good way if you develop a course, like if you're going to develop a course, but a facilitator is going to have to teach it who didn't design it, having them create a Wikifolio for their incoming learners to look at is a good way for learners to feel that social presence of that AI, to feel connected with that adjunct, but also getting the adjunct up to speed or the associate instructor up to speed to teach the course. For larger courses, I would recommend consider creating podcasts or videos, but these don't these aren't content like most people create. They just model engagement rather than presenting the content. You only introduce the content well enough to talk about, either have the instructor or an expert talk about how they engage with the content to model it. And this is important because conversational recordings are relatively easy to make, whereas content recordings are remarkably difficult. Those lynda.com videos and Professor Messer videos that you can link to, those people are very experienced people and they've spent a lot of time learning how to do those and then make and edit those. You can interview a student who successfully completed the course. You can interview experts. In P507, I created the videos with a grant with the help of an expert. Uh, for the first set of them, for the later ones, I just did them myself using this. But so I go ahead and introduce the content, but in my talking about them, I'm only explaining how I use these concepts in the actual course students are learning. So I don't go through and explain what these things are. I just assume the students have a textbook that they can look at. I talk about how I engage with those concepts in my class. In the course on cybersecurity that we developed and networking concepts, we interviewed a entry-level K-12 network analyst and a seasoned network engineer about how they use concepts in either analyzing their network for security or designing a network to keep it secure. And it was really hard for us to get them out of this delivery mode. Experts want to sort of explain and explain a lot, and that gets really boring at the outset. You want instead to explain how they engage with those contexts and, again, modeling that engagement. The thing about experts is they're really bad at teaching. So often they'll give examples and they'll describe things in impossibly abstract ways for the students that you're targeting. Just get them to explain how they use the concepts. And when they can't explain how they use the concepts, get them to say that. Say, I don't know, but I think anybody who's an expert in the field needs to know this. Step 13, this is optional. I've been very deeply immersed in the micro-credential or open badges world. It turns out that Wikifolios are perfectly suited for letting students share what they learned uh, in the course. And it also is really well suited to so-called 21st century skills, which are very, very difficult to assess. If you just put the evidence of those practices in the badge, and then you allow someone with the time and the expertise and the motivation to make that assessment, like somebody who might hire or work with somebody who completed a course, well, they're the ones who can open up and look at those threaded discussions and judge for themselves whether that student has expertise. This allows discursive competencies. My badges in my assessment book said To the extent that the earner discussed work with peers, this badge is evidence of the earner's ability to do so. Right? So we get past this idea of these behavioral competencies into these ones where they're actually discursive competencies. And in fact, we lead with them. Now, all LMSs now allow schools to install an Open Badges API. I recommend you consider Badger. Here at IU, unfortunately, we've not been allowed to use Badger because of we have a very strict policy. We have Credly. Credly is problematic from my perspective because it's difficult to upload the evidence. Now, an important point if you're going to do this, if you're using an LMS, it's impossible basically to make work that was completed inside of the LMS publicly viewable. In that case, as is the case at the cybersecurity courses in Indiana University High School, we have them do their work on Google Docs, and that allows each student to adjust their settings to the level of public uh, viewability that they wish to support. So this final step is just the routine stuff, the housekeeping. You need to design a homepage. Uh, in my course, I just put up a page uh, and asks, and then a homepage for each student, and then have them just cut and paste the URL for each week. With lower grade students, you may need to give them more help. Um, Now, here's an issue with Canvas. So to reiterate, in Canvas, each week we have students generate a new discussion page, and that's what's used for their Wikifolio. And that's because Canvas does not allow threaded discussions on student pages. On one hand, the discussion list is one way of viewing Wikifolios. The problem with it is it doesn't differentiate between drafts that students are still working on and complete posts. So that's a good way. Having them go ahead and put up a link to their Wikifolio as a way of communicating to the instructor for early review process and grading that they're done. So you want to remind students not to submit their Wikifolio content. Sometimes students think that that's what they're being asked to do because it's kind of an odd, that's what a lot of instructors do. You want to tell them, no, 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 don't paste the content of your Wikifolio into the submission window. Rather, in the submission window, provide me some feedback on my assignments. How much time did you spend, and was anything confusing? Um, Now, grading practices are pretty important in my cohorted courses where there's a weekly deadline, typically on Sunday night. I penalize students a point a day, 1% of their grade per day that they're late, and that's usually enough to keep students from getting behind. So let's wrap this up. What else is going on? Well, we have a couple of projects. We've got an exciting one that the National Science Foundation funded, where theoretically and practically, we're really at the intersection of expansive framing and more socio-constructivist approaches, such as playable case studies, which is a form of anchored instruction that my colleagues at BYU are doing, and that's continuing some exciting work in cybersecurity. We now have a survey of expansive framing. I was working with Trip Harris and Dubravka Svetina. This has data from 6,000 students from NESI. We've recently completed the exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis that indeed did confirm that our factor structures of expansive framing did hold up. Um, we're doing a study of cultural engagement reflections. This is what I mentioned earlier, and I'll be presenting this later on in the conference today. We're trying to use new social learning analytics to automate what was otherwise a very laborious thematic analysis of Wikifolio posts and cultural reflections. I've got a couple of proposals going forward that I'm really excited about using expansive framing, and we really want to take this framework I showed you today and go back to IUHS and restart that research practice partnership and expand framing out to all of the other courses at Indiana University High School. If you're interested, there's some other references. You can email me at dthickey, DTHICKEY. I'm happy, dthickey at indiana.edu, and I'm happy to forward you any of these articles that are either published or underway. Thank you very much. I hope you found this was useful, and good luck to you in everything you do.